In the basement of Millbrook County's abandoned courthouse, beneath water-stained deed books and moth-eaten marriage certificates, lies a ledger page that 3 different clerks tried to destroy. The ink bleeds where someone scratched through a marriage entry with a penknife. Joseph Harwick, age 53, to Sarah Harwick, age 21. Same surname, same address on Thornridge Valley Road. But 2 columns over, in shaking handwriting, the same clerk rewrote it. Joseph Harwick to Sarah Harwick, mother and son. The coroner's margin note scrawled in fading pencil. Jaw fracture pattern identical in both subjects. Impossible, unless... The sentence cuts off. Dr. Marcus Greenfield never finished another autopsy report. 3 headstones in Millbrook Cemetery bear the same birth year carved beneath the name Harwick. The dates of death span 47 years, yet local records show only 1 burial plot was ever purchased. This is the file they sealed for 50 years. The case that broke 6 medical professionals and sent 2 federal investigators into early retirement. When the department finally declassified the documents in 1987, 90% came back as solid black rectangles. What remained was enough to map the spiral. Subscribe so these files don't disappear again. Thornridge Valley cuts through the Millbrook Hills like a wound that won't heal properly. The fog settles there first and lifts last, pooling in the hollow where 3 dirt roads converge into something that barely deserves the name of intersection. Maps from different decades show the roads bending at different angles, as if the cartographers couldn't agree on what they were seeing. Paper fails in Thornridge Valley. Photographs develop with shadows that weren't visible through the viewfinder. Recording equipment picks up frequencies that hurt to hear. Whispers layered beneath whispers, words in a dialect that predates the county's founding. But memory hardens there like scar tissue. Ask anyone who's walked those paths about the Harwick place, and they'll tell you things they swear they never witnessed. The sound of children's laughter echoing from a foundation that's been empty since the fire. The smell of burning applewood that follows you home and clings to your clothes for weeks. The locals don't talk about what happened on the ridge. They just know to avoid the old logging trail that winds past the Harwick ruins, especially when the fog rolls in thick enough to muffle footsteps that aren't your own. Ezekiel Harwick arrived in Millbrook County in 1889 with a young woman he called his ward and a wooden ring carved from a single piece of applewood. Census records list her as Mary, age 19, relation, household. But the marriage certificate filed 6 months later tells a different story. Mary Harwick, age 19, to Ezekiel Harwick, age 52. Ward to husband. The ring passed from Mary's finger to her daughter's, then to her daughter's daughter. Always applewood, always carved with the same spiral pattern that deepened with each generation's touch. Local jewelers refused to resize it. They said the wood felt wrong under their tools, too soft in some places, hard as bone in others. Church records from St. Timothy's note that the Harwicks attended services faithfully, but Reverend Morrison's private journal reveals his growing unease. They sit together in the back pew, the whole family, but their laughter overlaps in ways that make my teeth ache. When young Sarah looks at her father Joseph, she has her grandmother's expression. When she looks at her son, she has that same expression again. The phrase first appears in Morrison's journal in 1923. When the quiet answers, the bride returns. He wrote it after visiting the Harwick place to deliver last rites to the eldest daughter. She whispered it 3 times before she died, though her mouth was full of blood, and her tongue had swollen past speech. Morrison burned his journal that winter, but the phrase survived, carved into the applewood ring's inner band, in letters so small they looked like scratches, until you held them to the light. The Harwick belief system operated on a principle of rotation and return. Daughters became mothers. Mothers became brides. Sons became fathers to their own siblings. The family maintained detailed genealogical charts that read like crop rotation schedules, which bloodlines needed strengthening, which combinations produced the most viable offspring, which unions brought the family closer to whatever they were trying to achieve. Sarah Harwick's quilts, recovered from the ruins after the fire, contained patterns that mapped these relationships. Fabric squares arranged in spirals, with thread colors indicating generational connections. Red thread for blood ties, white for marriage bonds, black for the children who didn't survive their first winter. The ledgers found in the cellar showed the same spiral pattern repeated in columns of names and dates, signatures that looped back on themselves, birth records where the father's signature matched the grandfather's handwriting exactly, as if the same hand had signed documents 40 years apart. In Joseph Harwick's personal folio, investigators found a single page covered in a drawing of the applewood ring, rendered in such detail that you could see the wood grain pattern. Beneath it, in careful script, the circle closes when the bride remembers. Each generation grows closer to the quiet that answers. The page was dated 3 days before the fire that consumed the Harwick house, and everyone inside it. The Harwick house defied architectural logic from its foundation to its collapsed roof. Built in stages over 4 generations, it sprawled across the ridge in a pattern that hurt to follow. Corridors that led into other corridors, windows that faced other windows across impossible interior courtyards, rooms that could only be reached by passing through 3 other rooms in sequence. The cellar well widened as it deepened, carved directly into the limestone bedrock. By the time county surveyors measured it in 1964, the opening at the bottom was nearly twice the diameter of the top. Water had never been struck, but visitors reported hearing voices rising from the depths, conversations between people who had been dead for decades. Fire assessor reports noted structural anomalies that suggested deliberate construction. Every wall refuses plumb, but the deviations follow a consistent pattern. The house leans inward on itself, as if designed to funnel sound and movement toward a central point that no longer exists. The main staircase spiraled down from the 3rd floor to the cellar in a continuous curve that made visitors dizzy. Photographs showed deep grooves worn into the wooden steps, as if the same feet had climbed up and down for generations, following the exact same path each time. After the fire, investigators found that the ruins maintained their spiral pattern. Debris had fallen in concentric circles around the old well opening, with the heaviest beams forming the outer ring and charred personal belongings spiraling inward toward the center. Dr. Margaret Chen arrived in Millbrook County in September 1963, summoned by a letter sealed with an impression of the applewood ring. The wax had been scored with tooth marks, as if someone had bitten down on the seal before it hardened. The letter contained a single request: "Come tend the birth that completes the circle." Chen's medical journal, found in her abandoned office 3 months later, documented her first visit to the Harwick place with clinical precision that gradually dissolved into disturbed fragments. Her initial entries described a standard high-risk pregnancy consultation. Sarah Harwick, age 34, was expecting her 4th child by her son Michael, age 21. "Patient presence with familial relationship that violates standard medical ethics," Chen wrote. However, legal marriage certificate on file. All parties of consenting age. Proceeding with care under protest. But her later entries revealed growing concern about what she was witnessing. Paired portraits hung throughout the house. Photographs of family members separated by decades who shared identical facial features, down to the placement of moles and the angle of their smiles. Children's dolls sat in every room, each carved to resemble a specific family member, their wooden features worn smooth by constant handling. The cellar chapel contained pews arranged in concentric circles around an altar carved from a single piece of applewood. Chen's notes described ritual implements that serve no medical purpose, but which the family insists are necessary for proper delivery. Her final entry, dated October 15th, contained only one line: "The quiet has begun to answer." The remaining pages had been torn from the journal. Chen herself vanished the night before Sarah Harwick went into labor, leaving behind her medical bag and a resignation letter written in handwriting that didn't match her earlier entries. Sarah Harwick's pregnancy progressed with anomalies that defied Dr. Chen's 30 years of medical experience. The patient's skin had become translucent enough to show the network of veins beneath, pulsing in patterns that seemed synchronized with sounds only Sarah could hear. During examinations, the skin would shear at the slightest touch, leaving Chen's gloves stained with fluid that smelled like burning wood. Fetal monitoring equipment registered readings that suggested multiple heartbeats, but ultrasound showed only one child. The monitors picked up what the attending nurse described as clustered brainwave activity. It sounded like whispering when we turned up the volume. Sarah's eyes had begun to change color during her 7th month, shifting from brown to a pale gray that reflected light like water. She claimed she could see her grandmother Mary standing in the corner of the delivery room, still wearing the applewood ring and whispering instructions in a voice that came from inside Sarah's own throat. The family called it the return, the point in each generation when the newest bride began channeling the voices of her predecessors. Michael Harwick, the child's father and Sarah's son, documented these episodes in letters to his deceased grandfather. Mother speaks with grandmother's voice now. She knows things that happened before she was born. She remembers being married to my great-grandfather when she was 19. Medical staff noted that Sarah's abdominal movements seemed to respond to external stimuli in impossible ways. When visitors approached her bedside, the child would shift toward their voices. When Michael played recordings of his grandmother's voice, the movements would synchronize with the speech patterns, as if the unborn child was listening and responding to conversations from beyond the grave. Sarah Harwick's labor began at 3:17 a.m. on October 31st, 1963. The delivery room at Millbrook General filled with the smell of burning applewood, though no fires were burning within 20 miles of the hospital. Dr. Chen's replacement, Dr. William Harper, noted that the patient's screams harmonized with voices that no one else in the room was making. The child emerged with a cranial dome so translucent that the separate brain lobes were visible beneath the membrane. As Harper watched, the skull began splitting along suture lines that should have been fused, revealing pulsing tissue that seemed to beat with its own rhythm. The infant's fingers numbered 7 on each hand, arranged in a spiral fan pattern with nail beds that had already split and begun bleeding. Its limbs emerged at anatomically impossible angles, arms that twisted like vines around each other, legs fused at the thighs but separate at the feet. As Harper attempted to separate the twisted appendages, the seams of flesh began tearing under the weight, revealing bone structures that defied classification. The child had multiple eyes, 3 that tracked independently across a face that seemed to shift between resembling different family members. Vitreous fluid leaked down its cheeks in clear streams. The eyelids refused to close simultaneously, giving the impression of a face that was always partially awake, always watching. Instead of crying, it made sounds like overlapping radio static, punctuated by humming in froth, equancies that made the delivery room staff nauseous. Pink froth bubbled at its lips with each exhalation, and when it tried to vocalize, multiple voices seemed to emerge from the same throat. The child lived for 6 days. On the morning of November the 6th, hospital staff found its body arranged in a perfect spiral on the delivery room floor, with a thin arc of dark fluid smeared in concentric circles around it. Security cameras had recorded nothing. The doors had remained locked from the inside. During its brief life, the Harwick child displayed behaviors that violated every principle of neonatal development. Instead of the reflexive crying typical of newborns, it produced continuous harmonic humming that seemed to respond to voices in the room. When family members spoke, the humming would shift pitch to match their vocal patterns, creating an unsettling chorus of overlapping frequencies. The child's breathing expelled pink-tinged froth that carried the persistent scent of applewood smoke. Hospital staff noted that the smell would cling to their uniforms and follow them home, lingering in their houses for days after each shift. Most disturbing was the child's apparent recognition of family members it had never seen before. When Michael Harwick showed it photographs of his deceased relatives, the multiple eyes would track to specific faces with obvious intent. When he spoke the names of grandparents who had died decades earlier, the child would attempt to mouth the syllables, its malformed lips struggling to form sounds it had no vocal development to produce. Sarah Harwick spent those 6 days in a semi-catatonic state, whispering conversations with family members who existed only in photographs. She would hold the applewood ring to her ear as if listening to instructions, then relay messages to her son about preparation for the next turn of the spiral. The medical staff found themselves divided between professional obligation, scientific curiosity, and growing nausea at what they were witnessing. 3 nurses requested transfers to other departments. Dr. Harper began drinking during his shifts and was found one morning in the hospital chapel, praying in a language that the chaplain didn't recognize. On the 6th day, Sarah whispered to her son, "The quiet is ready to answer again. The bride returns tomorrow." The unmarked vehicles arrived at Millbrook General at 4:47 a.m. on November 7th, 12 hours after the child's death. Agents from an organization that identified itself only as the Center presented hospital administrators with federal seizure orders that required the immediate surrender of all medical records, photographs, and biological samples related to the Harwick case. Dr. Harper's protest was noted in the official transcript. "This is a medical anomaly of unprecedented scientific importance. The research applications alone could revolutionize our understanding of human development." The lead agent's response was redacted from all surviving documents. Within 6 hours, the Age Nets had confiscated the child's body, all medical equipment that had been used during the delivery, the blood-stained bedding, and even sections of flooring from the delivery room. Hospital staff were required to sign non-disclosure agreements that carried federal criminal penalties for violation. The official death certificate listed cause of death as multiple congenital anomalies. No other details were recorded. Sarah Harwick's medical records were similarly sanitized, reducing a pregnancy that had defied medical explanation to a single-line entry. Patient delivered stillborn child with developmental abnormalities. Local rumors suggested that the child's remains were incinerated at a federal facility outside the county, but the center's final report, declassified in 1987, contained only one legible paragraph. Biological materials disposed of according to Protocol 7. Genetic samples demonstrate intentional multi-generational manipulation. Recommend permanent classification for public safety. The file remained sealed for 24 years. When portions were finally released, 90% of the content had been redacted with black bars so thick they seemed to absorb light. 3 months after the federal seizure, Millbrook County residents began reporting encounters with a figure that defied easy description. Children claimed to see a young person with Sarah Harwick's facial features walking the ridge paths at dusk, but adults who glimpsed the same figure swore it was a middle-aged man with Joseph Harwick's distinctive jawline. The figure wore a scar around its ring finger in the exact pattern of the applewood ring's spiral carving. When it spoke, and several witnesses swore they heard it speaking, the voice carried overlapping tones, as if multiple people were talking through the same mouth simultaneously. It refused shelter, sleeping outdoors even during the harshest winter storms. Farmers found spiral patterns carved into their barn doors and fence posts, the cuts so precise they seemed burned rather than carved. The figure would appear at property lines, leaving behind small wooden slips with phrases carved in letters too small to read without magnification. "When the quiet answers, the bride has returned," read one slip found nailed to the ruins of the old Harwick house. Another, discovered in the county courthouse mail slot, carried a variant. "The quiet answered, she returns through me." The figure vanished completely in spring 1964, but circular stains began appearing. On surfaces throughout the county, brown marks that smelled of applewood and blood, arranged in perfect spirals on courthouse steps, church floors, and hospital walls. The stains resisted all cleaning attempts and would reappear within days of being painted over. County Surveyor Thomas Redfield was mapping property boundaries in 1967 when he discovered architectural remains that weren't listed in any official records. Hidden beneath 40 years of undergrowth, a stone staircase spiraled down into the hillside behind the Harwick ruins, leading to a round chamber that had somehow survived the fire. Redfield's field notes, found in his abandoned survey equipment 3 days later, described walls lined with cracked mirrors that reflected images from angles that shouldn't have been possible. In the center of the chamber sat a wooden ring, not applewood, but carved from some darker wood that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. The ring bore an initial carved into its inner band, S. But when Redfield photographed it, the developed film showed the initial as M, then E, then S again, as if the carving was shifting between different letters with each exposure. His final field note, written in handwriting that became increasingly erratic. The mirrors show the same room, but from decades apart. I can see people in the reflections who aren't standing in front of the mirrors. They're wearing clothes from different eras, but they all have the same face. The ring is warm to the touch, and when I hold it, I can hear voices discussing my grandfather's name. But my grandfather died before I was born, and I never told anyone here what his name was. The report ended mid-sentence. Redfield submitted his resignation to the county office that afternoon, claiming a family emergency in another state. His whereabouts remained unknown. Subsequent investigations found only the ring and a dark stain on the chamber floor in a perfect circular pattern, as if something had been arranged there and left to seep into the stone. Graduate student Patricia Nomura arrived in Millbrook County in 1978 as part of a folklore documentation project through the state university. Her academic interest in regional family histories led her to county records that mapped an unusual pattern of property transfers, marriage certificates, and fire insurance claims spanning nearly a century. When plotted on a geographical survey, the incidents formed a spiral pattern centered on Thornridge Valley. House fires occurred at regular intervals, always completely destroying the structures, but leaving distinctive circular burn patterns in the surrounding earth. Marriage records showed repeated instances of unions between parties sharing surnames and addresses. Property deeds transferred land between family members whose birth dates and death dates suggested relationships that violated biological possibility. Nomura's research notes, found in her abandoned dormitory room, documented her growing conviction that she was mapping evidence of intentional, multi-generation experimentation by unknown parties. Her analysis of declassified federal documents suggested government awareness of the pattern dating back to the 1920s. Microfilm records from the period showed extensive redactions, but enough text remained visible to suggest ongoing federal monitoring of the Harwick family line. One partially legible intelligence report contained the phrase, "Subject demonstrates inherited anomalies consistent with deliberate genetic manipulation. Recommend continued observation pending final outcome of experimental process." Nomura's academic advisor received her final report in December 1978, but noted that sections of the document appeared to have been rewritten in different handwriting. Her concluding paragraph read, "The quiet has been answering for 90 years. I understand now what the ring is for." She withdrew from the university program the following semester, citing health reasons. Attempts to contact her at her family address in Oregon were unsuccessful. Her research materials vanished from the university archives, leaving only checkout cards signed in her name. Official explanations for the Thornridge Valley incidents focus on the psychological effects of rural isolation, the tendency of small communities to mythologize unusual events, and the documented impact of environmental factors on birth defect rates in the region. State Health Department reports cite elevated levels of naturally occurring minerals in the local water supply that could account for developmental anomalies. Sociologists point to the economic pressures that might drive isolated families into patterns of intermarriage and social insularity that appear unusual to outside observers. Federal investigators, when pressed about the classified nature of their interest in the case, reference national security protocols related to genetic research and the protection of individuals with rare medical conditions from exploitation by sensationalist media. But the whispers persist in Millbrook County. Children born in the valley still show unusually high rates of polydactyly and cranial asymmetry. Property records continue to show transfers between parties whose relationships resist genealogical explanation. And every few years, someone finds another wooden ring carved in the distinctive spiral pattern, always accompanied by variations of the same phrase. The applewood ring surfaced again in 2019, discovered in the estate sale belongings of a woman whose genealogy traced back to the original Harwick settlement. The auctioneer noted that bidding for the piece was unusually aggressive, with buyers offering amounts far exceeding its apparent value as rustic jewelry. The winning bidder identified her as Lef as Sarah Harwick Chen, age 19, recently married to Michael Harwick Chen, age 47. Both carried documentation showing legal name changes from their birth names, and both wore identical scarring around their ring fingers in the familiar spiral pattern. When questioned about their relationship, Sarah Harwick Chen smiled with an expression that witnesses described as familiar in a way that made your teeth ache. She placed the ring on her finger with reverence typically reserved for religious artifacts and whispered, just loud enough for the auctioneer to hear, "When the quiet answers, the bride returns home." The couple purchased property on Thornridge Valley Road within the month. Construction permits filed with the county showed plans for a house built in the familiar spiral pattern, with a cellar well that widened as it deepened and rooms that could only be reached by passing through other rooms in sequence. But the most unsettling detail in their building application was a handwritten note in the margins, signed by the architect. Per client specifications, all mirrors will be positioned to reflect other mirrors. Basement acoustics designed to amplify whispers from lower levels. The note was dated October 31st, 2019. The same date Sarah Harwick Chen's medical records showed she conceived her first child. In the basement of Millbrook County's courthouse, beneath water-stained deed books and moth-eaten marriage certificates, someone has added a new entry to the old ledger. Sarah Harwick Chen, aged 19, to Michael Harwick Chen, age 47. Same pattern, same spiral, same blood-stained ink that seems to move when you're not looking directly at it. The quiet is answering again. The bride has returned. What happened in that delivery room in 1963? What did the federal agents really find that required 50 years of classification? And why do the children born in Thornridge Valley still carry the mark of something that should have died out generations ago? Let me know in the comments what other sealed cases you want me to investigate. And don't forget to subscribe, because some stories refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep you try to bury them.